Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, a podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. I have some behind-the-scenes info. Or at least I always forget our intro.
I do too.
It's like 11 words. Well, you forget who goes first.
Yes,
or
you're right.
Who says it, and I forget what it actually is. I think it's like right before you go out and speak in front of an audience or something. I have the same thing, but when recording for a podcast, so I always forget the intro.
But you remembered!
Yes. And if I didn't, we would have waited until I did.
That's true.
The power of editing and recording.
So this is our last episode of 2018.
Yes. Happy late Christmas. Everyone that celebrates.
Happy holidays, season's
Yes.
greetings, all the other ones.
Yeah. Happy winter. Winter solstice passed.
Happy Christmas, if that's the way you say it.
I started saying that just to pretend like I'm at Hogwarts with Ron and Harry in that first movie.
Yeah, apparently they use both happy and merry.
Oh, okay.
I, for a long time, thought they only said happy Christmas, and then
Yeah.
at some point I realized that that's not true. It's just maybe more salient to us because it's wrong.
Yeah.
Quote unquote wrong.
Yeah. Well, you know how Americans like to be quote unquote right. I mean, you're not.
No, in
you're
this
not
case it's a
American,
North
but
American.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
I never want to drag anyone else into it.
Okay, so we have some emails. So Katie messaged us to say, thank you so much for your episode about Philly English. I grew up outside of New York City, but my husband's family is from the Philly area. My mother-in-law grew up in South Philly and has a positive any more that you discussed in that episode. I'd figured out what it means from hearing it so much, but it still made me feel a little confused every time I heard it. Same. I mean, I know what it means and I still have to like stop and process it.
Wait, can we do it again? Say it. I like to go there anymore.
Yeah.
And that means you're still actively going there and you like it.
It means you didn't used to go there, but now you do.
There's a change in state.
Yeah. So, or like, he smokes anymore. He didn't used to, but now he does.
Okay.
I'm so glad I finally understand. My husband doesn't seem to have positive anymore in his speech, but he also doesn't think it sounds remarkable in any way. So he probably does, but it just hasn't,
Right.
You just haven't heard it yet. I've noticed that he and his side of his family I'll have another construction that I don't have, where I might say I'm done with or finished with something. They drop the with and just use done. For example, he might say, I'm done this book, I'm done dinner. Do you know if this is a feature characteristic of Philly English as well, or if adding with the feature of New York English? Thanks so much and love the show. So yes, I do know. Do you know?
No, tell me.
Okay, so there are some regions, Philly is one of them, Canada is another, where you don't need to use the with.
So tell it to me. Tell me something.
Like I'm done my homework.
Yeah, I definitely don't have that.
Yeah, it sounds really strange to people who don't have the feature, and I'm pretty sure it's like Philly and maybe that's it. Or Pittsburgh too. I can't remember, but it's not very common in the United States at all, but it's really common in Canada.
Meaning everywhere in Canada?
As far as I know, I've never heard anyone say, "Oh, this region doesn't have that." That doesn't mean that's not the case.
Right.
So anyone knows if there's a regional distinction, let me know. But it's very widespread regardless.
Well, that's fun. You posted you on Twitter posted a great our 10 best episodes of 2018. Can I just say that I'm really impressed with Philadelphia?
Seriously.
Like, y'all make me want to go visit.
It's a great city.
Yeah. Oh, you've been there. You love your city and the way you speak, and I love it. And it's infectious. And thank you to Betsy Sneller, Dr. Betsy Sneller.
Yeah, for blowing up.
Woo! Yeah. After she was on the show, she did a radio morning show, which is fun. Yeah. So Philadelphia, and it was one of my favorite titles that we did.
That is true.
So that's cool.
I mean, it was literally just taken from the episode itself, but
yeah, it was literally a quote. So thanks Betsy for that.
So we did have another email from someone who seemed to really think that switching like language pronunciation of a proper name within a different language, so you switch from English to Spanish pronunciation or English to French pronunciation, but just for the name of the proper name of the town, the place name, seemed to think that this was just not done. And it is. And we actually have an example of it in this very episode. The way that Abby pronounces Peru.
Yeah, that's true.
It happens.
My dad does it all the time. He would never not say it with like the Spanish pronunciation, even when he's speaking English. There's no way.
Yeah, I think if it's your language, and you're speaking in your second language, you're probably going to just use your first language's pronunciation. And sometimes it's the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, and I feel guilty not doing it because in Arizona, we have a, I don't know, is it more a town, not a city, Casa Grande? And I always say Casa Grande, like everyone else in Arizona.
Because that's the, at least the Anglo Arizona pronunciation. When I first got here, I kept calling it Casa Grande. I mean, it's still anglicized, but like I thought that's how you pronounce it. It took me forever to realize it's Casa Grande.
Oh yeah.
Which I actually kind of I don't know, place names are so fascinating, and I kind of like it when they get mangled like that. Like it's fun,
and there's a lot of emotion like attached to it too.
Yeah. Yes. That I think that's exactly the point. Like if someone is pronouncing it in a particular way, there's probably a reason for that. So why shit on them for doing it?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is one more email that we got from Tony. My name is Tony, and I just listened to your podcast with a Philly accent. So yes, the Philly one blew up. Anyway.
Yes.
I have to tell you, I loved it. I'm from the Philly area, both parents born and raised in Philly, and I found your show very interesting. I also have a podcast called Finding Subjects, and I listened to it, and he does have a Philly accent. It's really cool. Yeah. I notice when I'm doing the show by myself, I talk different than when I have a guest on. Alone, I seem to pronounce words less Philly-like, but when a friend is on, I'm more Philly, and I never realized that until listening to your show.
Yep.
So feel free to listen to my show to hear the difference. And I haven't heard one with him talking to someone else, but I heard the Philly accent, well, when he was talking about himself. So I just can only imagine how much more Philly-like it gets.
Yes. That's my favorite because, I mean, we're just social creatures.
Yes.
Even as like, I mean, I ultimately would, probably rather be alone and reading. But, I mean, still a social creature, right? We're all social creatures.
Yeah.
And it's like, when I am around someone that speaks Spanish, my vowels get different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He also said, I only mention this because I want to give a blanket okay to people. If you don't mind, I'd like to mention your show on my next episode. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody, you don't have to ask us. You can talk about us. I mean, obviously, if you're mean, you can still do it. It's your show.
Yeah, I mean, I got asked if someone could use a link to one of our episodes in a presentation they were giving at a conference.
Very cool.
Yeah, and of course.
Yeah,
please.
Feel free. I mean, it's kind of out there in the public, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's why it was so scary to start a podcast, because now I'm just out there, but we knew that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it's like, if we wouldn't put it out there if we didn't feel good about it, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, please share.
So today we are talking with Dr. Abby Bayunimi about heritage languages.
We're so excited today to have Dr. Abby Bayunimi. She received her PhD in Hispanic linguistics from the University of Minnesota in 2015, and we are going to talk about heritage languages today, which is very exciting. I feel like heritage languages are something that kind of pop up in media a lot. So let's just go straight into what is a heritage language.
Sure. I am using one from Ann Kelleher, who is at the University of California, Davis, and this is from the Center for Applied Linguistics. Her definition is, in general, the term heritage language learner is used to describe a person studying a language who has proficiency in or a cultural connection to that language. However, just as there are different kinds of heritage languages, there are different types of heritage language learners.
And do you get the sense that this is something that gets misrepresented in media, just kind of like code switching is? Because I've seen this thing where code switching is just used kind of to talk about anything these days. Do you think the same thing's happening with heritage language learner?
I think so, because I think a lot of the time when people hear heritage language learner, they think of people of color, usually Latinx or Hispanic people, because by far it's the largest second language group in the United States. So there's this whole thing around, well, why don't you learn English? You should be speaking English. And so there's this misunderstanding of what a heritage language learner or speaker is, and the stigma that goes along with it too. Because you have white people who are heritage speakers of languages as well. Like, you could consider my spouse a heritage speaker of Swedish because his grandfather came over from Sweden, and his family grew up, and he has got really pretty much receptive bilingualism as far as the Swedish language goes, because he didn't really speak it very much. But that's another type, but you don't really hear people talk about that. Or
right, because it's not as stigmatized.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about this before we started to chat. In 2005, so I don't know if this is how it's still being done, but when I was an undergraduate going to University of Arizona, I had to take this computer test to place me into a foreign language class. And I wanted to take Spanish. And when I took the Spanish test, there was some demographic info they wanted, and they were like, did you ever hear Spanish in the home? And I clicked yes, but I'm not a productive speaker of Spanish, but at the end of this test, I still got placed in a heritage language class for Spanish, in which I believe in a level that was way beyond what I could perform at. Do you have any sense of if this is still happening or what's going on with that?
That's actually really early for that sort of thing to be happening. In my experience, a lot of those placement tests don't consider background at all. When I took the placement test in the 2000s, it was just, you test in the modalities, and then you get placed based on how well you scored on the exam. There's no questions about, have you ever heard this language in your home or been in this country or anything like that. So that's actually sort of ironically progressive.
Yeah. But also I was like, oh, I think I should they probably want to hear no. Well, they don't want to hear no, but if I put no, I might be placed in what I really should be placed in, but I didn't want to say no.
But you would have still a leg up than over people who had the same level of skills but hadn't heard it in the home. So it's not completely wrong what they did. Maybe they just put you slightly too high.
Yeah. So the problem with that is that there usually weren't and aren't enough people that identify as a heritage language speaker to justify entire sections of each level of class. So what you end up having, and I had tons of students like this. I mean, when I say tons, I mean teens of them. But they would be varying levels of proficiency. A lot of them were what we call perceptive. So they have a lot of listening and reading skills, maybe not writing and speaking. These students would get put in levels that were above their productive capabilities. And so that would lead them to feel it would lead to a lot of linguistic insecurity, because you have all these Anglo students who are speaking better in quotation marks than you,
and writing better than quotation marks better than you, because they learned where to put the accent marks, and
you're like, oh, now we're going to practice subjunctive, and they're like, what the fuck is that?
Exactly. No, totally. Where they can, these quote unquote heritage language speakers that are placed in these classes, can use the subjunctive and they don't know they're using the subjunctive,
Mm-hmm.
but they're going to still feel insecure, at least,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if it's the right environment for that to grow some insecurity, right?
Yeah. And there's so much other stuff that parents are actually doing to their kids too that that adds to that insecurity as well. Like one of my participants in my dissertation was actually a heritage speaker of Spanish. Her mom was from Argentina and her dad was from the United States, and so she grew up hearing and speaking Spanish, and you know she had Argentine relatives and everything. But there was this moment where her mom was like, I'm not doing this anymore. We're not raising a bilingual child because racism." So she stops encouraging her to speak Spanish, and so she ended up in this like intermediate Spanish class in her college. And my study was just was an ethnographic study of language production over time, and so she wore this little lapel microphone, and she would forget that it's there, and sometimes she would talk to herself, and you know, she would talk to her classmates and stuff. They did a lot of like group work, and her accent was just pure Argentine. It was so interesting and beautiful to listen to. And her classmates would be like, "Gosh, you just sound so great when you speak. You know, I love your accent. It sounds so cool." And she's like, "No, I'm not good. No, no, I'm just like you guys. No, I'm not. I'm not." And she just had so much reluctance to speak in class for the longest time because, you know, she would try to practice with her mom, and her mom was like, "No, I'm not doing that. You're not good enough. I'm not, you know, this is."
Oh.
Yeah, she'd say, I have too much stuff to do. I can't sit here while you try to tell me something and it doesn't sound right.
Oh,
And
that's
yeah,
Oh.
so there's like
terrible.
layers.
I mean, you know, I'm used to the story where very, very well, I mean, her mom in her own way was probably well-meaning, but I hear the stories of very
Mm-hmm.
well-meaning parents like my dad who just was like, kind of subconsciously was like, not going to teach my kids Spanish because it's stigmatized. They might
Yep.
as well get the easiest route through life here. So I don't have to
Yep.
worry about that. But to hear like this kind of like, no, oh, you know, I can't hear your accent right now. It's not right. It's hard to hear.
Yeah, and then there are other students who are told it's sort of that like, you know, you'll have an easier time in life if you just speak English all the time, and you'll have the advantage that I don't have because I don't speak English all that well. There's this other level of well, we don't speak good quotation marks Spanish because we're from a poor rural community in Guatemala or something like that, and we don't speak quote unquote proper Spanish. So you're by default not going to speak it either. So you need to go to Spanish classes and learn good Spanish. And so they get that from their parents, like, you know, what we speak at home isn't good. And then you'll have usually white teachers who have never studied sociolinguistics who are also like, you don't speak good Spanish. And so there's like all these things coming at these poor kids to try to undermine their confidence in their abilities.
What can we do better at the university level? I'm thinking of, because that's where you taught, right?
Yeah.
What
Yep.
can we do
Yep.
better for these students that are labeled heritage language learners?
Oh God, so many things. So the ideal thing would be that you have a parallel track for heritage language learners from the beginning to the advanced level that is structured more like a language arts class instead of a foreign language class. And so you start with content-based curriculum from the beginning instead of, you know, some of the stuff that we're doing right now with our second language learners, which is a lot of communicative stuff, which is good, but it's also not necessarily content-based, and so it's not taking advantage of this cultural knowledge and receptive abilities. Like, you're not doing as many movies or readings or, you know, in-depth readings. A lot of places are kind of moving towards that because they see the value in both for heritage language learners and traditional second language learners. But there's still a lot of places that aren't doing that. So having that parallel track is, I think, the ideal. In reality, I don't think that there are budgetary allowances for that in both the faculty and in what the administration will pay for, you know, opening new sections and things like
Right.
that. Because if you have a small program and you have 5 heritage language learners and each one is at a different level, I mean, you know, you can't open a section for each one of those people, right? Moving more towards a content-based curriculum, I think is really helpful. Making your teachers, whether you're in high school or post-secondary, take a sociolinguistics
Yeah.
class and stop talking about how their home language is terrible and framing it more as a, like, okay, I'm going to teach you a different register. You have your home register, which is valid and good and great. What I'm teaching you now is academic Spanish, which is what I did.
Right.
when I was teaching, because we didn't have the heritage language track because we didn't have the enrollment to justify it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the bare minimum, though.
Yeah. I got the sense as a student at a university that it was always PhD students that taught foreign language classes.
Yeah, the majority of the faculty that taught language classes was non-tenure track or graduate students.
I mean, my TA training at the university level was bullshit. Let's be real.
Wait, did you actually get any? Because I didn't. I was just like,
it was like a pamphlet.
A pamphlet is still more than I got. I was like, here's what you're going to be talking about in your tutorial. Bye.
Yeah.
So we actually were forced to take a methods class, a teaching methods class, our first semester. It still wasn't enough, but we were forced to do it just because I got my degree in a foreign language department, and so they knew that we were all like their undergraduate language, grunt work army. So we had to. I mean, the literature people, the culture people, and the linguistics people all had to take a language acquisition pedagogy course at the start of our careers. So,
and did you think it was a good course? Just not enough? Like, it was a beginning?
Yeah, it was good. It wasn't necessarily enough. It gave you the basics to start doing thoughtful lesson planning and figuring out how to make tasks that, will promote language acquisition and use and things like that, and course design and assessment design and those sorts of things. So we created exams together, and we created some lessons together and basically learned the foundation of language acquisition. But again, we didn't really talk about heritage language learners. That was me taking further linguistics classes and sociolinguistics classes that helped really cement that.
I'm thinking about how the second point that you made of we can do better is to treat the language of the home as valid, which is so true. And I actually ran across, I don't know if it was a paper or conversation about how, and I've said this like in our first episode, how I'm like, people need to hear my vocal fry different. Like I don't have to change me. Yeah. People have to hear my vocal fry different. That's how I feel about like the Spanish we bring from home or whatever, people need to fucking start listening to our Spanish differently. And I just think like that's like worlds away. Do you feel that way sometimes? Like, instead of teaching like kind of like I have to teach you academic Spanish, like, but you're valid, this is all valid. It's just kind of like, why can't we change the way people hear us kind of thing?
Well, I mean, in academia, though, people are going to expect certain things. So.
It's hard. I know. I totally get it. It's hard. I'm asking a question that's just so hard, like putting it out there.
So I think that's easier to do at the college level than at the high school level, because you have all these like, lifer teachers that learned audiolingual method and repeat after me and let's write grammar charts on the board, and it's all just very terrible.
Yeah,
yes,
I'm having a flashback to my high school Spanish classes. It's awful.
I'm so sorry.
So I mean, I don't mean to say every Spanish teacher in high school is awful. I just had some very
no, they're not. But it's the traditional way that languages are taught, so there's still a lot of people doing it. I mean, I had that, and I went to college and jumped into a communicative classroom, and I was like, what the fuck? I can't say anything. You're going to make me talk? Nope. Yeah.
Exactly. The most talking we did was actually, like, conjugating. Like, we never said sentences. We'd be like, okay, conjugate,
really?
comer. Yeah, you had better than Carrie.
Well, I mean, yes, we had better French instruction, but it still wasn't great. There was a lot of conjugation, but we still had to say full sentences.
Well, my Spanish teacher didn't even speak Spanish, so no. I'm not joking. I went to a small Catholic school, and I don't know how she got that job, but we had a couple of exchange students from Colombia, and they would sit in the back of the class and make fun of her because she couldn't speak Spanish at all. And so what we did was vocab lists on the board and conjugations, and it was... I don't know how I tested into Spanish 3, but I did.
So we got these people that are kind of stuck in this very traditional and outdated way in high schools, but you think like at the college level, we got some promise.
Yeah, because this is sort of a bad good kind of thing. So the people who graduate with Spanish PhDs are either literature, culture, or linguistics, right? And so the literature and culture people are like, I don't want to teach anything but my favorite novel. Language classes are below me, and we have an army of linguists who need jobs, and they can direct our language program, and they can teach all of our language classes. So, I mean, it's kind of good bad because there's more jobs for linguists. They're not always tenure track, and they're usually like directing language programs and teaching undergraduate language courses. But that means that you get more people who at least have perhaps been exposed to sociolinguistics and understand language variation, teaching your undergraduates their language courses. And this is more true in for your colleges than in your universities where degree programs are granted because, or like advanced degree programs are, like PhD programs.
Could you give an example of how, like, quote unquote, academic Spanish might look differently than something that a student would bring into the classroom, just for the listeners to kind of understand?
Yeah, so one example is with the subjunctive, which we know is very unstable. And so there's an if-then clause in Spanish where it's like, see something with the subjunctive, then the conditional. There are some dialects, I think, it's been a while since I've looked at this literature, but I think Peru might be a place where this happens, where it's all subjunctive, so the conditional doesn't exist in
cool.
those constructions. So it's like see subjunctive, then subjunctive, yeah, or the reverse, where it's all conditional. So instead of the subjunctive, it's see conditional, then conditional. If conditional, then conditional. So that might be something that people will bring into the classroom, something like that. And so we have to say, okay, yeah, that's totally fine. That's the way that your family does it. And this is the way it's used in where your family comes from. And that's totally fine. For academic Spanish, we want to do it this way instead.
And I think the big thing, and I think we were joking about this on Twitter once, because I'm doing Babel Spanish, and it's so clearly from Spain. The lexical items. So I think lexical items are going to be a big thing that people are going to bring into the classroom that are different, right? That you might have different words for. Is that as big of an issue? Like, would you teach them other words for things, or is it more like grammatical structure that would look different in academic Spanish?
I think it's both. Like, I always warned my I guess, that, the textbooks are very generalized and they often have a peninsular bent. Textbooks are getting better though, so like the last one that I used for an advanced accelerated intermediate course, which is basically 2 semesters in one, which was very intense, but it offered like all the variations and it told you where they were from because a sociolinguist helped write it.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's like,
really cool.
This is, banana is this in this country and this in this country and this in this country. And so you have all these different ways of presenting it. And I told them, I'm like, I don't care. I don't give discrete vocabulary tests, whichever one you feel like you want to use, do that one.
I mean, you're going to have to also learn a bunch of like more academic jargon stuff. And that's just like across the board going to be true.
Yeah. And that was more for like the advanced writing courses and like intro to Hispanic linguistics, then we got into more of that. But for the undergraduate language courses, not as much.
Yeah.
I mean, this is definitely analogous to monolingual English speakers going into an English comp class, right? So we bring what we bring to the classroom, and then they're going to teach us academic English, right? They're going to try to tell us not to split infinitives or whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever bullshit that they're going to try to teach us.
And I actually got to a point where I would have students who were heritage speakers, they would raise their hand and they're like, well, my family says it like this. Is that still right? And I would just be like, yeah, I mean, if you want to use that in your speech all the time, but if I give you a writing exercise, then we have to have you try to use this other way just so you can gain proficiency in that. But, in your casual writing or in your speech, that's totally fine. Or they would raise their hand and be like, at my house, we call it this. And I'm like, that's cool. Let's write that on the board. Look at that dialectal variation.
I love that. Well, I love that they're sharing that with you because I think that's a step toward getting rid of the internalized stigma that they have. Because if you're like, just going through these kind of steps myself too, if you're really, really ashamed of what's going on with your language, you're not going to raise your hand and share anything.
Right.
So that's a really good thing that's starting to happen if you share.
That usually doesn't happen right away in the semester. Like, I'm thinking of about one student in particular. Oh, I just love her. She is such an amazing person. I still keep in touch with her even though I quit teaching in 2016. She's just such a rock star. She's doing so many cool things. But anyway, at the beginning of the class, it was her first Spanish language class outside of high school, and they placed her in my intermediate course, and she was like, I speak Spanish at home, and my parents told me that I have to learn better Spanish, and that I'm not very good at whatever. And I'm like, that's bullshit. You're great. You're wonderful. Like, I embrace the variety you speak at home. If you want to ask me questions in class, like, well, I say it this way. Why is that different? We can talk about that. And so she was just like, oh my God. And at the end of the semester, she gave me a card and she's like, my Spanish has improved exponentially, my confidence in myself and my identity as a Latina and like all this. And I'm just like, holy shit, this is amazing. See, more teachers need to do this because it
Yes.
is
I got
so
chills.
important.
I had chills.
Yeah, it's so important because these kids are not getting validated. And language is so tied to your identity and your culture.
Yeah, yeah. And you're in Minnesota. I just wonder, what is the Latinx population like there?
Bigger than you think.
Yeah,
It's bigger than I think.
It is. Traditionally, we had a very large, like I live in St. Paul, and the whole west side of St. Paul is Chicano. There is a very large Mexican population from the Bracero program, where the United States brought in workers for the meat packing plants. We have like the Hormel plant, where we have a lot of Central American immigrants that work in the meat processing plants there, and some farms and stuff like that. But it's mostly the meat processing plants. And the restaurant industry too. The restaurant industry is big. We had I did a gig with a local restaurant because they were doing some accounting thing and they wanted input from all their employees, and surprise surprise, they weren't getting input from their Spanish speaking employees because there was a language barrier. And so they brought me in to teach them the accounting stuff and get their buy-in and get their input and all that stuff. So and most of pretty much 100% of the back of house, the dishwashers and the cooks and the prep cooks and all that, they were Spanish speakers with limited or minimal English proficiency. So yeah, it's bigger than you think.
Yeah. I mean, everything's bigger than I think. I've spent all of my life in Arizona where I'm like, we have a ton of Chicanos here. So like, I always think that I'm overestimating if I assume that there's Chicanos anywhere besides LA and Chicago. So, yeah. Do you think that there's a lot of heritage speakers that don't get labeled heritage speakers at the university then? The computer program is failing them? Or I don't know if failing them, but just not catching them?
That's a tough question because a lot of the kids that I had in my classes weren't from Minnesota. So I don't know if they're going to different colleges, if they're not going to college, if they're going to community college, if they're not taking Spanish. That's kind of hard to say because they don't, I mean, just because you live here doesn't mean you go to college here or go to college at all. So I don't really have much contact with high school Spanish teachers to know whether that's.
Yeah, I guess I have probably a bias to think that if you're first gen, you'll probably go really close to home. So I was just like wondering if maybe the students that are getting to go to college or want to go to college go and are not being placed in Spanish classes. But
no, the student that I just mentioned, she's from somewhere in like the southeast or something like that. Maybe it might be as north as Chicago, but she's not from Minnesota. And then I had another young lady in a more advanced communications course who she might have been a DACA student and also was from Chicago. The very first one I had, I think she was from Minnesota. And then there were a couple of them along the way who might have been from Minnesota, but there were, it really depends because especially with the University of Minnesota, we have a reciprocal program with Wisconsin. And so, yeah, if you live in Wisconsin, you get in-state tuition. So we would get a lot of students from like Milwaukee, outside of Chicago kind of area too. So
I wonder, there's got to be heritage language speakers of whatever language listening. We talked about what could be done at the college level. What do you have any like particular messages to people that feel insecure about language as someone who was grading papers or interacting with heritage language speakers?
I think heritage language learners bring so much richness to the classroom, and not that you should be there to be the token like cultural ambassador or anything, but usually they have ways of looking at authentic texts and ways of relating to these texts that when they start talking about it, it kind of makes the non-heritage speakers rethink the way that they're reading something. They're reading a poem, reading a novel, or watching a movie, or when they're hearing, if you're more of a productive heritage speaker and you speak in your family's dialect or variety, I think it also helps benefit everybody around you to get that input, like authentic input from someone who doesn't speak, generic newscaster Spanish or peninsular Spanish, which is what traditionally a lot of the audio materials have been in. It's just another perspective. It's another, like, I'm a big proponent of collaboration, and I think every single student has something important to offer to the classroom. And just because you don't know where the accent goes on, the past tense or whatever, that doesn't mean you don't have something important to contribute to the class.
Yeah. And also, like, we should always remind ourselves that writing and speaking are very different. And like, if you could be like an amazing speaker and a terrible writer, and vice versa. And for me, especially, like, I found writing in French easier than speaking because I had that time to process and remember the rules, and and I didn't have to worry as much about the pronunciation.
Well, yeah, and that's the other thing. A heritage speaker, if they feel insecure about the way they speak or the way they write, or, I don't write as well as, this person next to me, there's something that you do really well that they're jealous of.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
Maybe your pronunciation is like really cool and really, sounds really good, and you have like a really natural flow to the way you speak, and it's not really stilted and stuttered. While that the way that some language learners speech is at first, when they're still kind of figuring out that processing thing, there's something that you're better at. It's like that whole thing when people say jealousy is useless because there's always someone better and someone worse than you.
Yep.
So I mean, we all bring our own uniqueness to the classroom, and it's no reason to feel insecure because there's something that you're really awesome at that someone else really sucks at, and they wish they were you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you we've talked about one side of the coin. What about the flip side? Have you had heritage language speakers that were very insecure about their English? Or does that just not come out in the classroom because you're teaching Spanish?
Yeah, I don't think that really comes out in my classrooms. I think that might come out more in an ESL kind of situation. But no, I haven't. I mean, I've encountered that outside of the classroom where someone is bilingual and they're just kind of like, my English is not good. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I understand everything you're trying to tell me, and you're speaking fluidly, and there's no problem here. I'm not even having to like ask you to repeat yourself to get at what you're trying to say, so not really in the classroom, but outside of it for sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of people underestimate just like getting your point across as being like what language is. Like, we're so obsessed with getting things quote unquote perfect that we're like, that I just understood you. Like, we're having a conversation and our ideas are going back and forth. Nothing else matters.
So one thing I like to tell my students, especially my first year and second year students who are like, oh, I can't talk in the classroom because I don't know how to form a sentence or whatever. And I'm like, nobody does except for me. And so that's okay. But also record yourself speaking English and write down all of the errors that you make without knowing it. And they're like, holy shit. And they do it, or they think about it, or they do it, and they're like, shit, I didn't realize how many bad grammar mistakes I make when I speak English. God, that's okay. This is not a problem then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and guess what? When you sit down and write an email in English or whatever, you don't have time to think it over before you, it's just different. Speaking and writing are so different.
And that's why I never graded people for accuracy when they're speaking in class, because I'm like, I just want you to talk. I'll give you 3 points if you're, fully engaged in the class, 2 points if you are, somewhat engaged, 1 point if you're sitting there in the corner looking out the window, and 0 if you're not in class. And so that gives the students really a lot of freedom to participate in a way that they feel comfortable. And, I knew other professors who graded based on how correct this, Spanish their students were using was, and those classes were usually silent. I would walk past the classroom and like nobody was talking, but then I had to shut my door all the time because my students were so loud.
That's such a good problem to have, though.
I know, it was really, I really miss teaching sometimes.
Yeah, I sometimes miss it too.
I know, it's like sometimes.
Just not the grading.
No, not the grading.
Especially since it's so demoralizing for you too if you care about students. It's like, why do I have to I don't know. Grading is an interesting other problem.
Yeah.
I just overhear like at coffee shops so many professors that are grading for all the wrong things, and who am I to say what wrong is? But I'm like,
well,
do you really have to take off for that?
Yeah.
Like,
I would say marking off a split infinitive is actually objectively wrong.
Yeah.
or claiming that the passive is ungrammatical is objectively wrong.
Oh.
yeah.
Yeah.
Are there things in Spanish like that too?
Yeah, I struggle with that a lot because, I'm supposed to be teaching them this artificial academic register. And so, like, yes, I'm supposed to be doing the copy editing of their papers, but I also want to know what their ideas are like. So I came up with a rubric that was, part of it was ideas and organization of ideas and elaboration of ideas and sources and things like that. And then a smaller part of it was, grammar stuff. And so if I would have been full-time somewhere with a lot of support, I would have had multiple drafts where they could correct that stuff. But
yeah.
I wonder, do you have any feelings or thoughts or experience with younger kids? Because this seems to be a really big, I'm going to call it a fucking problem right now, where we're not doing right by kids that come into our K through 12 that speak Spanish at home, that are, I mean, they're labeled so many things, and sometimes it's heritage language learner. Have you any experience? Have you read any of the stuff that's happening?
I have many feelings, and some of them are shouty about how we treat those kids. I think that the expectation that people should come. Okay, first of all, let me back up a little bit. This whole like hysteria about, oh my God, whatever language is going to take over the country and no one will speak English anymore is such bullshit. Because if you go to the Pew Research Center, they did research on heritage languages, like all of them: Tagalog, Chinese, Mandarin, Spanish, whatever. By the third generation, these people aren't speaking their language anymore.
Exactly.
So it's like totally unfounded bullshit, whatever. And so then we have these administrators who think that, and people who are providing the funding for courses and programs and stuff, who think, oh, well, you have an ESL class, you can have people from any old language come in and mishmash together to learn English, and they will do it in 2 years or 4 years or whatever the case may be. And that's not tenable. You don't necessarily have people who are ready to be integrated into English-only classrooms after that. And it frustrates the shit out of me, because these kids deserve better, they deserve more, and then you wonder why they might be falling behind, because they're stuck in a classroom where they're not necessarily able to thrive the way they would if they had support in their native language. And it's just so frustrating. There's dual immersion programs, and I think Minnesota's actually the leader in dual education, in dual language education. We have the most programs of anybody in the United States, I think in front of California. So we have dual immersion in Korean, German, French, Spanish, Chinese, and there might be Hmong, and there might also be like Aramaic or other Somali languages as well. But these programs are excellent because you get these kids who speak, whatever language as their first language or home language, and you get American students or United States students who don't speak this language, and you put them together in the first grade, and they are in 100%, the other language for like the first 4 years or whatever, and then they start to gradually switch over to all English. So by the time they graduate in 8th grade, they're in 100% English, but they still have that other language too. So I think those programs are super helpful, and I know that some of my colleagues at the U of M in the Carla Institute, which is the Center for I can't remember, it's been so long, but they do a lot of work on immersion studies, and they found that the kids, the native or heritage speakers who start out in dual immersion, end up doing better in high school and college when they have that support.
Well, I'm thinking, like, you see them when they're in college, imagine. You're going to see kids that aren't as insecure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how important is that? Like, I mean, yeah, okay, they got some more language skills that look a little bit different than what they might look like at home, and they had like all this, like, I don't know, like academic support in the school, but that all leads to, I think the most important thing is not feeling fucking insecure
Yep.
about the language you came with. And
Yep.
that's why I was interested about younger kids, is because you are seeing them later. And
Yep.
the foundation for how they feel is set so young.
Yeah, very young.
Because they start out seeing their language as being valid and valued and important and something that you do academic work in. And, your teachers all speak it and your administrators all speak it. And
Yeah, exactly. And when we talked to Alberto Rios, the poet, about his experience with Spanish and English, he was talking about going to school and how, like, they would make him feel like Spanish was bad. And then you, like, put this label on your mom, on, I think it was
his dad.
It was dad.
His mom was English.
His mom was English, yeah. On his dad, that he's bad. Like, it just...
Yeah,
that's
that
what you do when
judgment.
you're a kid.
Yep, that judgment can come from your parents. It can come from your school. It can come from your friends. It can come from TV. It can come from politicians. It can come from anywhere or all of those places, and it is traumatizing.
It is,
and it's bad for development.
Yeah. I was thinking, just like thinking about child development, they're doing the best they can with the information they are given, and they're trying to reconcile these things this information they're given, and this is what's coming out. That Spanish equals bad, family,
unless you're white,
family language is bad. Yeah, right, exactly. Exactly, it's true.
Yeah,
because there is no stigma around white kids taking a foreign language from beginning or going to dual immersion or whatever. There's no stigma.
Dual immersion is going, like, the way that dual immersion is becoming popularized is because white families are seeing the benefit.
Yep.
And it's one of those other things where I'm like, listen to my vocal fry and you adjust to it. It's kind of like, shit, we should want dual immersion because we have these kids that aren't English speakers, but it was only until we realized the benefit for
all children,
mainstream. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Which means white.
And probably not just white, probably like upper middle class, because this is the same thing that happens in Canada with the French. There's no like stigma around like the type of people who speak French because we're all white. Well, it's more complicated than that, but but people who put their kids in French immersion tend to be upper middle class, and so there's like fanciness associated with it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what I really appreciate about Minnesota's immersion programs is that a lot of them are public.
Well, they're public in Canada too, but they're still it's like self-segregating.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But it is accessible to, I mean, there are some charter and private ones, but there are really good public ones that are available to anyone who is interested in that. But you're right. It tends to be middle upper class because they're the ones who read the research and are like, oh, good for development, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, English or Arizona has the law, was it 200, where it's English must be taught in English. So it's illegal to have anything but, what do we have? Like, I don't know. It's basically sink or swim is what we have in Arizona. I'm really excited, though. Arizona has an actual bilingual speech-language pathologist who's going to be our new superintendent of schools who really, really cares about bilingualism.
That's
great. Hoping that we're going to see something good happen. I think that one of the main things that when I knew that we were going to talk about heritage languages, which made me really excited, and also I'm like, oh no, we're going to talk about so many things that are so disturbing. But I want a lot of people to know that it does start so young, like, in that we may, if we're teaching in college level, or even if it's just like our peers, there may be some, like, there are a lot of complicated feelings about the language that languages we have, and.
I mean, if you dive into the media and all of the conversations among Latinx communities in the United States, there's all this, like, if you speak Spanish, are you really Latinx? Or if you don't speak it, excuse me.
Right.
So, like, there are all these nuances and complications around whether, you are actually part of your cultural group if you don't speak the language. So
yeah, it's like remezcla or something, like some of these media that I, like, follow all the time, and I know what they're doing, like they're starting a conversation, but I literally cry when I read, like, I don't know why I play them, because they're really mean.
Really?
Some people,
And so you'll get, even from inside your, cultural
it might be
group.
Worse.
I think so.
In some ways it's worse, yeah.
I think, especially when it comes, like, from your parents or your family or whatever,
yes,
like, oh, you don't speak Spanish or you don't speak whatever, you're not really whatever, It's very hurtful for kids. And then if they go to school and their teacher's like, you don't speak good Spanish, then that like compounds on that pain that they're already feeling because they feel rejected by their community. But you want to know something really interesting. So, just to prove that, Spanish speakers aren't a monolith, like in Cuba or Cuban Spanish in Miami, like there's Spanish everywhere. There are Spanish
yeah.
programs in schools,
this,
but
yeah.
most of the Cuban people that came and established all that were white.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
But like in the places where most of the Spanish speakers are brown or not white, then you have a lot more of these like severe, you don't speak Spanish in the home, you don't speak Spanish in the school,
Yeah.
your
That's
Spanish
a really good
is
point.
terrible, you
Yeah.
know. But when it's like the doctors and lawyers who are refugees from Cuba speaking it, oh yeah, let's set up, schools and newspapers and radio programs and TV programs and everybody,
Yep.
so
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
God,
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh.
every time we bump up against this, well, not every time. A lot of times we bump up against this, but it just makes me so fucking upset how racist both my country and the United States are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes.
And what sucks is that it's not overt racism. It's like really subtle because
It
it's
can
not
be, yeah.
something. Yeah, but I mean, like, if you're telling your kid, oh, your Spanish isn't good, it's not like you're saying, or if you're a teacher and saying your Spanish isn't good, it's not like you're saying, I don't like brown people necessarily, because maybe they don't think they're being racist. They are, but they don't think they are.
Right. Or they think
it's
they're
not-
talking about it because they like really love Spanish, and so they think
Right.
they're like,
the Spanish from Spain is beautiful.
That's
and it's
usually what it comes down to.
one because the Real Academia is the one that sets all the rules, and okay, but that's colonialist and
100%.
Do you get a sense in your heritage language classes? How did the students feel about Spanglish?
So in my language classes, it didn't come up a lot. In linguistics classes, we actually had a chapter on it or a section on it. We didn't call it Spanglish. We called it like code switching. So there's that like super, I hate this word, seminal article on code switching from Ricardo Otegui, and some other people that I can't remember right now because it's been like 3 years since I've taught that class. But so usually people are like, oh, that just means you don't speak either language very well. And I'm like, actually not. So, using that article, we would teach that at the end of the semester, and they would be like, oh, shit, it's actually, regulated. Like, it has rules and, grammatical barriers when you can do it, boundaries, and, so, and then I would have students, because I had people write like a research proposal, so they would do everything except for, actually carry out the study and then do the analysis, because I couldn't get IRB approval because I was a grad student, and also we didn't have time.
Yeah, no, it takes a long time.
Yeah, they would read all of the literature on code switching, and they were super into it afterwards, and they thought it was super cool. And then I taught a composition and communication class, which is basically like the bridge course between languages and the major, where you learn how to write more long form and all that sort of thing, and consume different kinds of narratives and write in different genres. And we did have a couple of like poetry or literature pieces that dealt with switching languages, and usually they would have, if not neutral, maybe slightly negative attitude toward it. And I'm talking about students in general, because I didn't have enough of a sample size of heritage speakers to kind of determine like this is what they think writ large. But they would, they ended up thinking it was really cool because they could see how it was used stylistically and for emphasis or for some other effect in the writing. So,
well, when I think of heritage language, I want one of the things that they know about when they switch between languages is that it takes so much skill.
Yeah, that's what I always told my students. I'm like, if you can code switch fluently, that's a very sophisticated use of both languages. And
so sophisticated.
So, they were usually pretty surprised to hear that. And then I think I had some videos of someone code switching that I would play in my linguistics classes that people thought were really fun. So, but I never really encountered like, oh, people who do that are stupid or, not good at semilingual or, however negative thing they want to call it.
That's good. It's terrible, but that's what's happening in the kids' literature.
That's bad.
Yuck.
That's really bad.
One of the first articles I was given was by my advisor was like, read this and tell me why it's wrong. But it's kind of an older thing and saying like, well, they come to start at 5 years old or whatever, and they're not completely good at Spanish, and then their English is, you know, like kind of developing, so like they have like no language, they're like in this like limbo.
Oh, gross.
Or like yeah, it's not good.
You know how unlikely it is for someone to not have any language? Like, oh my God.
Unless they're like locked away in an attic or something and never have any interaction
the forbidden
with anything.
experiment.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I mean, we're not talking about like language disability or anything.
No.
Right? You have language.
You do, yeah.
Yeah. And this gets more complicated with sign as well.
But you just have maybe a slightly different version of whatever it is that you're doing. But that's
right.
We all do. Like,
So I guess I've heard kind of critiques along those lines of the dual immersion program. So the people are like, no, English only.
Yes.
They say, oh, well, you know, they're not going to be as good at either language. They're just going to suck at both of them. And it's like, yeah, sometimes there are delays.
Yes, for sure.
But they more than catch up with their peers by a certain level. Like by high school or like middle high school, they're usually at or beyond their peers.
Yeah.
And it's not a concept delay, right? You're still going to have the concepts. You just might only have the words in one language. Well, I could talk about this like for hours.
I know, me too.
And we probably shouldn't, because we want the podcast listeners to listen and not lose us. But no, I think this was really, really good and really interesting. Do you feel like there's anything that we missed that's really important to know about heritage language speakers?
I think we hit on everything. I think that we need to stop valuing bilingualism in white kids and not valuing it in kids of color. I think that teachers need to take a sociolinguistics class and understand language variation before they get to teach it. I think that heritage language learners should be encouraged to learn in whatever way they want to, their home language, if they want to, and be encouraged to use it however they feel comfortable using it. And I really wish that we had more funding for like language arts style classes for heritage language learners, because they do learn slightly differently than people learning a second language.
And when you say language art, you're kind of like meaning putting the culture in there too. Like, let's have cultural lessons.
Yeah.
Right.
So like how we do in the United States, how we do language arts classes in English should be how we do it for heritage speakers too. Because, you know, that support where they're getting like cultural readings and, you know, movies and all these other things that help support that language, because we know that language is tied to culture. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And, you know, people who speak a language at home or hear a language at home have a different cultural context than someone who's going to school to learn it and have never experienced it before outside of their classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it wouldn't fucking hurt so much if I like just didn't know Spanish, if it weren't so tied to culture, you know, like, and like this kind of cultural connection I feel like I'm missing, because there are a lot of Latino people that are saying I am missing something very important.
And I think that it's important to educate parents too about the fact that, you know, it's okay that they maybe don't speak as well as you do, or, you know, are trying. Let's just encourage them to be supportive instead of like, wow, I don't have time to listen to you struggle through this, you know, I don't understand what you're trying to say to me.
And also, kids are going to speak differently than you do. Always.
Yes, they are.
Stop saying "get off my lawn." Like,
Say
the kids
get
will be
on
all
my
right.
lawn. At least to
This
your own
linguistic
kids.
landscape.
All right. Well, that was really great.
Very
Thank
cool.
you so much, Abby.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abby.
Super
And
fun.
As always, don't be an asshole. Can you say it in Spanish for us?
No seas pendejo.
Yes. That's a beautiful
Don't
way
be
to
an
say it.
asshole.
Or for those in Spain, no seas gilipollas.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Nice.
Very cool. Yeah, just don't be an asshole.
So I think that's
Yeah,
three
don't
different
be an
versions
asshole.
we've gotten in Spanish now.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, what
'cause we
was the
had
third one?
It was the Argentinian version, so I can't.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Alrighty.
Beautiful. All right. Bye.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by Chris Ayres for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com.